I want to start with a quote from the series Little Fires Everywhere. You didn't make good choices. You had good choices. That line I think was super profound, and it has a lot to do with what I'm going to be talking about here. It's not that these people have success or are able to acquire wealth because they always made the perfect best choice. A lot of times it's because the options and the choices that were presented to them through no work or effort of their own were inherently better choices. We talk about the fallacy that the United States or that the world is a meritocracy, and that, wherever you are, it's 100% through your own efforts, your own work, your own struggle. There's no such thing as a quote unquote self-made man, because literally no man has ever made himself. Literally, none of us can take credit for our existence here on this planet. None of us can take credit for being alive today. And so a lot of our existence, the fact that we were born, the fact that we are on this planet living and breathing, had a lot to do with choices and circumstances that happened and that played out long before we ever came into existence. And so I want to kind of normalize acknowledging that, a lot in our life is about our choices, and a lot is not about our choices. And sometimes people are uncomfortable sitting in that duality, but it's reality. In terms of colorism, though, so narrowing this conversation down a little bit to just colorism. Historically speaking, in countries around the world, historically, lighter skinned people have had greater access to education. People with the lighter skin tones have had more economic advantages, right? They've had more resources, more social capital, more economic capital, more political capital, right? And so because of that history, the offspring, the descendants, the progeny of those lighter skinned people are also going to benefit from that, are likely to have the opportunity to benefit from that. Now, whether they squander their opportunities or not, it's on them, but they at least have the opportunity to benefit from what their parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents, all the resources in various forms of capital, social, political, financial capital that they inherited. There's no guarantee that their descendants will also be light-skinned, right? And so I want to be clear about that. Just because your grandparents are light-skinned doesn't mean that you're necessarily light-skinned. But that does partially explain the continued persistent income and wealth gap. So income is not the same as wealth. I'm not a financial expert, but I know that much, right? So the income gaps, but also the wealth gaps are explained in part because of these generational cycles. The caste system in a lot of Asian cultures, where the caste is closely tied to skin tone, right? It doesn't guarantee that everyone in a caste is going to have the same skin tone, but there are patterns and trends that suggest that people in the higher caste, in terms of that hierarchy, more often than not have lighter skin tones as well. And so they have been able to entrench, because the caste system is particularly entrenched and rigid in a lot of ways. They've been able to reserve and conserve that capital, again, financial, political, social capital, all the things. They've been able to preserve that for generations. In the United States, when we think about African Americans, I've also done a live stream on things like blue vein societies and paper bag tests, where part of that generational cycle of passing down wealth and capital and resources was intentionally done by lighter skinned or mixed race groups of people who wanted to exclude access to their organizations, exclude access to their schools, exclude access to their churches and opportunities and even social circles and social networks to only those with lighter skin tones. The present wealth gap. Part of it is explained through present day discrimination. Present day biases in hiring. That was the past 2 weeks, I've talked about biases in hiring as well as biases in pay and wage discrimination, right? So yes, we can partly explain the wealth gaps between lighter skinned people of a race and darker skinned people of that same race through present day 2023 discrimination and biases in hiring and pay. But that gap is also partly explained in the inheritances that people have gotten from a lighter skinned parent or even a white grandparent or a white parent, right? And when I say inheritances, I mean, again, when you understand that in many places, the United States is most present for me because it's my personal experience, but Black people who were enslaved, they literally could not legally establish wills and trusts, right? And so even if you wanted to pass things down, even if you were allowed to or had the privilege to acquire an income or work for extra wages or have something financial to pass down, a lot of times the court systems would not acknowledge that. The legal system at that time was not set up for Black people to pass down wealth to their descendants. And so white people, more often than not, have had the legal recourse, have had the inheritances of even financial information, right? We talk all the people out there, I'm not one of them, but all the people out there who are on a mission to increase financial literacy amongst BIPOC folks, amongst Black folks, they're doing really important work, right? And so if your great-grandfather founded a bank or founded some type of financial institution, they're not just passing down money as an inheritance, they're also passing down financial knowledge. They're passing down insider knowledge that historically marginalized groups were intentionally denied access to. All the ways that Black people have been shut out intentionally and institutionally shut out from acquiring wealth over the generations has directly benefited white people and their descendants, but also lighter skinned people and their descendants as well, many of whom also have white ancestors. I also want to say now, people from historically marginalized groups also have our own forms of inheritance. A lot of times we have a wealth of inheritance. We have an abundance of resources and capital that our ancestors also passed down to us. It's just that in a capitalist system, the things we've inherited are devalued. The things we've inherited are often suppressed, right? And often not recognized in terms of being able to survive in a capitalist, again, white supremacist and patriarchal society, right? And so I think that I could do a whole other live stream just on the beautiful, rich inheritances that we have had as historically marginalized groups. But in navigating a capitalist system and navigating a white supremacist system, a lot of the things we inherit have not contributed to our financial prosperity. And again, it's intentional. Like white people are intentionally hoarding wealth and resources for themselves, right? So it's not that Black people or historically marginalized groups could not have attained these things, but the intentional barriers, this is what we talk about when we talk about systemic oppression and systemic privilege, where the society, the laws, the legal system, the court systems, for generations since the founding of this country have been set up to deny us access and resources to this. But not even just the financial things, also inheriting, for example, your parents' social network. If people underestimate the impact of these things. If your parent is an executive, when you go to college, when you get out on the job market, you're inheriting their knowledge of corporate America, you're inheriting their knowledge of how to navigate the business sector, you're inheriting their social network. Right? And so there's so much that people take for granted that is giving them an advantage over people from historically marginalized groups, okay? And then the second thing I'll say is, of course, and this is obvious to most of my followers, I think, your circumstances don't necessarily determine your outcome. They don't necessarily decide what your future is going to be, but they certainly influence it, right? They certainly have some bearing, if not on what you end up becoming, they might definitely influence or have an effect on how you get there. And I think that's something also we have to look at, because we always like tokenism. You know, people love tokenism. They're like, well, look at Obama. He became president. Or look at this person. She's CEO of this, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of times it's not that you come from a historically marginalized group so you can't attain certain things, but because of that context, because of that historical inheritance, the way you achieve that is going to be radically and significantly different than someone who started 50 yards ahead of you, right? Or 100 yards ahead of you because of what they inherited in terms of institutional knowledge, financial capital, and social capital from their parents, grandparents, etc. I mentioned in an Instagram comment recently about epigenetic trauma and how epigenetic trauma lasts for at least 7 generations. And I always talk about how this generation right here, the one that's my generation, younger generations, we're the first generation of African Americans who actually have capacity, bandwidth, and margin to really prioritize our mental health and our spiritual healing. My grandparents, even parents, great-grandparents, not only were they inheriting trauma from slavery, but they also were living through the trauma of Jim Crow, living through the trauma of lynchings and segregation, and literally for their survival could not prioritize spiritual and mental healing and well-being in the way that I see present day generations being able to really focus on that. I want all of you to honestly reflect, myself included, honestly reflect on what you've inherited from your family, right? And how have those inheritances opened up opportunities for you, or delayed opportunities, or completely shut out opportunities. Realize that your life, the context of it, is greater than just the little part of it that you've lived. And so think about how has the past, even before you were born, impacted the way you've been able to live your life. And of course, what we all have to ask is, then what am I going to do with that? What is my responsibility to myself, to my ancestors, to the people who are on either side of me living right now? What's my responsibility to my future generations? Your affirmation is, I actively cultivate self-awareness as a foundation for my justice and equity work. In order to be, I think, firmly rooted in justice and equity work, every single one of us has to acknowledge and practice awareness of what we've inherited and how that has shaped our reality. Take good care. Bye. Much love.